Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 211, New Men and Counselors. Last week, we reviewed Henry VIII's ascension to the throne and discussed the world in which Henry lived. Henry's court would prove to be one of the most important in English history. While Henry was certainly a force to be reckoned with, the backstabbing and politicking that would beset Henry's court from day one would dictate the course of history as much as the king did himself. In this episode, we look at the first several years of Henry's reign, and especially at some of the new men who are going to play a major role in the course of the next 10 years of history. Among the gentlemen of the Privy Chamber were some of the king's closest friends. These were the same young men who had been boys and then adolescents with the king. They had jousted together, gambled together, and made merry. In the company of his friends, Henry looked much more like a wealthy young man bent on having a good time than the King of England. Henry's favorite was Charles Brandon. We're not sure how old Brandon was. His date of birth has been lost. But we know that he was admitted to Prince Arthur's household as a page, and after Arthur's death in 1502, was brought up at court with Prince Henry. The two boys got along well together and would prove to be lifelong friends. He was the perfect companion for Henry, whom he so resembled in looks and build that many thought him to be Henry's bastard brother. In 1513, Henry would make Brandon a Knight of the Garter. Brandon was no intellectual match for Henry, but he would prove to be a competent soldier and courtier. He would be one of the few people around Henry who remained in the king's good graces until he died. The king's first groom of the stool, a valued post because of the intimacy involved, was William Compton. Compton had been a former ward of Henry VII. And had been the younger Henry's attendant since childhood. Another of the king's close companions was his distant cousin, Edward Neville. Again, the two looked so much alike that they were often confused for one another. Neville would be a constant face at court. Likewise, Sir Thomas Boleyn, Esquire of the Body, had been at court since 1501. During that time, Boleyn had acquired numerous titles and would, during the reign of Henry VIII, acquire many more. William Fitzwilliam, Henry's cupbearer, had also been brought up with the king and shared his love of the hunt. Fitzwilliam was only 1 year younger than Henry, and the two would remain close throughout their lives. Fitzwilliam was one of the few people at court who deliberately seems to have remained out of the factionalism that would shortly engulf Henry. Perhaps that is part of the reason that Henry liked him. During these early years, Henry was also fond of his cousin, Henry Courtenay, the Earl of Devon, though he was only 11 years old in 1509. Courtenay was one of several aristocratic companions of the king. While the Wars of the Roses had gutted some of England's aristocratic households, in 1509 there were still 45 great magnates or hereditary peers who owned upwards of 70% of the land in England. Now Henry shared his father's mistrust of nobility. Throughout his reign, he would only create 5 new peers and place severe limits on the number of private retainers that the great lords of the realm could keep. Henry was convinced that his reign would not be an age of private armies. Those nobles who did remain were kept very busy. Henry made sure everyone always had some kind of duty so that they could not plot against him, and rewarded loyalty lavishly. Where Henry VII had been all stick, Henry VIII was more balanced. And the nobility was pleased with Henry's ascension. They didn't like the dour Henry VII, who had sought to bind the nobility to him through financial bonds. This was a class of men who still very much lived in the medieval world of chivalry and had a very trumped-up sense of their honor and worth. They were ecstatic when Henry immediately announced that England would once more go to war with France. These young men dreamed of a return to the glory days of the 100 Years' War. Sir Thomas More at the time wrote, quote, "The nobility, long since at the mercy of the dregs of the population, i.e. Edmund Dudley, lifts its head and rejoices in such a king, and with good reason." But Henry had no intention of honoring the nobility with posts in the government simply because they had the good luck to be born into wealthy families. Service mattered more to Henry than birth, and he never gave anyone a pass simply because they came from a noble family. Nevertheless, the lords were a class apart, and Henry knew it. Only they sat in the upper chamber of Parliament, and Henry needed their cooperation if he was going to have a successful reign. Henry came to terms with that fact, while the nobility simultaneously understood that their wealth and power ultimately derived from Henry. I mean, nobles were not even free to marry without his consent. Henry made it clear that court was the place to be if one wanted to move up in the world. As a result, members of the nobility scrambled to be near him. This was an absolute change from the reign of his father, when only those commoners totally dependent on Henry VII were invited into the inner circle. One interesting change that Henry VIII absolutely made to the English nobility was how that class would value learning. In Italy and France, it was typical for men of power to be men of letters. The Renaissance valued book learning, and Henry desperately wanted his court to be like the cultured courts of Italy and France. But when Henry took the throne, such was not the case in England, where nobles scoffed at university-educated yeomen and intellectual civil servants. Henry changed this almost overnight. Before long, if you wanted to be successful in the Tudor court, you needed to be literate and well-versed in the issues of the day, including law and theology. In other words, Henry widened the definition of what it meant to be an aristocrat. The most important of the great magnates was Edward Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham. He traced his descent back to Edward III and lived very much like a magnate of the 14th century. If a rebellion was likely to come from anyone, it would come from Buckingham, who hated Henry VII with a passion, and to an extent, by extension, his son. Buckingham did sit on the Privy Council, but he was never one of Henry's close advisors. Buckingham was too proud, too haughty, and way too full of his lineage to ever succeed in Henry's world. He was good at jousting, which Henry liked, but beyond that, the two men didn't seem to have much in common. Thomas Grey, the Marquess of Dorset, ranked second after Buckingham, though he had no royal blood. The king liked him, and he served on the Privy Council, though, at the age of 40 in 1509, he was much too old to join Henry and his buddies on their adventures. Thomas Howard, Earl of Surrey, was the most influential nobleman on the council in 1509. He was 66, and certainly more of Henry VII's era, but both kings trusted him. And no one would question Howard's integrity. Famously, when Henry VII asked Howard why he had fought for Richard III at Bosworth Field, Howard replied, quote, "He was my crowned king, and if the parliamentary authority of England set the crown on a stock, I would fight for that stock. As I fought then for him, I will fight for you." Howard was an excellent soldier and administrator to boot, and the man that Henry relied on early and often. During the summer of 1509, Henry VIII and his courtiers embarked on an almost Olympic level of sporting activities. Henry was young and vigorous and sought to demonstrate his prowess. He had a reputation as a fine sportsman and wanted only to increase that reputation now that he was king. In his youth, his favorite pastimes had been jousting and hunting. Hunting was a royal and aristocratic sport. Henry's father had never allowed the young prince to joust against any real competition, so he often got all of his testosterone and aggression out through the hunt. The hunting, or grass, season, as it was then called, lasted from May or June to September or October, depending on the weather. Everyone related what an excellent horseman Henry was, so I have no reason to doubt them. According to one Venetian ambassador, he would train his horses for hours at a time, presumably while one of his ministers ran the kingdom. Henry's hunting trips often aligned with what was called a progress. A progress was a tour of the countryside, when the king would visit the different parts of his realm. In the summer of 1509, Henry wrote to King Ferdinand that such was what he was doing. We know very little about his first progress, though Henry did go on progress every year of his reign. Sure, he wanted to go hunting, and that was certainly part of the reason that he went. But he also knew that he needed to see and be seen by his people. It was a lot easier to love a king that you could put a face to, after all. Progresses lasted from 1 to 2 months and were completed during the late summer, usually between July and October. Henry's first summer was also spent attending a variety of tournaments. As a quick aside, Henry's reign was the swan song of the medieval tournament. By the time of Queen Elizabeth, chivalric tournaments, little more than pageants for the nobility, were a thing of the past. In January 1509, Henry went in person to open his first parliament at Westminster. Henry, by and large, never had any issues with Parliament. The great issues of the day involved the relationship between the crown and the church. Parliament supported Henry in his quest to wrest control of the English church away from Rome. As Henry attended that first Parliament, he was nevertheless desperate for news from London. Catherine was already pregnant, and Henry was hoping for a son and heir, the first shot out of the gate. But the Queen's pregnancy did not go according to plan. She went into labor on January the 31st, before she had reached 9 months. I'm not sure how far along she was. I couldn't find that in the sources. But she was certainly dangerously early, we know that. Catherine gave birth to a stillborn daughter. The king swallowed his disappointment, and it was 4 months before Catherine could even bring herself to write to her father in Spain and give him the bad news. On May the 1st, 1510, Catherine was already pregnant again. And around this time we get the first hard evidence that Henry had begun to stray from his wife. Our first report of his infidelity comes from a court hanger-on, who wrote as follows on May 28th of that year. What lately has happened is that 2 sisters of the Duke of Buckingham, both married, lived in the palace. One of them is the favorite of the Queen, and the other, it is said, is very much liked by the king, who went after her. Another version is that the love intrigues were not of the king, but of a young man, his favorite by the name of Compton, who carried on the love intrigue as if it was said for the king. And that is the more credible version, as the king has shown great displeasure at what I am going to tell. The favorite of the Queen has been very anxious in the matter of her sister, and has joined herself with the Duke, her brother, and her husband's sister, in order to consult on what should be done. The consequences were that, whilst the Duke was in the private apartments of his sister, who was suspected with the king, Compton came there to talk with her, saw the Duke, who intercepted him, quarreled with him, and the end of it was that he was severely reproached in very many hard words. The king was so offended that at this he reprimanded the Duke angrily. The same night the Duke left the palace and did not return for some days. At the same time, the husband of that lady went away, carried her off, and placed her in a convent 60 miles from here, that no one may see her. The king, having understood that all this proceeded from the sister, who is the favorite of the queen, the day after the one was gone, turned the other out of the palace and her husband with her. Believing that there were other women in the employment of the favorite, such as go about the palace insidiously, spying out every unwatched movement, in order to tell the queen, the king would have liked to have turned all of them out, only that it has appeared to him too great a scandal. Afterwards, almost all the court knew that the queen had been vexed with the king, and the king with her, and thus the storm went on between them. The queen by no means conceals her ill will toward Compton, and the king is very sorry for it. The fact that ladies were going about the court spying on the king strongly suggests that Catherine already had her suspicions. Now look, this was not a Catherine problem. This was a Henry problem. Henry was not faithful to any of his wives except maybe the final 2 Catherines, Howard and Parr. Certainly, once he married Catherine Parr, Henry's philandering days were over. Henry always liked to keep his affairs discreet, which is likely why he was so upset that someone found out about this one early on. All our evidence suggests that Henry was less faithful when his wives were pregnant. There was a taboo about having sexual intercourse with a woman who was pregnant in the 16th century. Henry believed that sex served 2 distinct purposes. Intercourse with his wife was always for the purpose of procreation and to keep the dynasty going. Sex outside the marriage was for pleasure. Though, when Henry did stray and a son resulted, he was not above raising the boy as a potential heir, as we will see. In July 1510, Henry stayed at Windsor Castle on the first stage of his summer progress. Windsor was still a medieval castle, rather than a Tudor palace, and Henry didn't like staying there. From Windsor, he moved on to Woking, which is today barely outside London, where he, quote, kept both jousts and tournaments. Henry VII had acquired Woking Castle in 1503 and began renovating. Henry VIII would continue that project, bringing the palace, well, to snuff, as they say. In addition to jousting and attending tourneys, the record is chock full of Henry attending various religious services in 1510. I point that out because it's worth noting that for more than half of his reign, Henry was a faithful son of the Holy Roman Catholic Church. After all, the Reformation will not even begin for another 7 years, and it'll be almost another decade before anyone realizes that this time it's for keeps. Henry was strictly Orthodox. Frankly, he would be until the end of his reign. Henry's break with Rome did not mean that he was going to follow Luther or Zwingli, as we're going to see. He was fierce when it came to persecuting heresy, and had no issue at all with burning those who opined subversive views. But he also loved theological debate and discussion, especially when he could prove how smart he was. Catherine's second pregnancy proceeded well. In September 1510, royal officials made preparations for the King's Nursery, which Henry and much of the realm hoped would soon be occupied by the future King of England. Catherine was expected to, quote, take to her chamber, around 4 to 6 weeks before the expected birth, and would be kept in relative seclusion from that point on to await said birth. After a royal tournament in November, the couple retired to Richmond, and from there, Catherine went into seclusion. She went into labor at the end of December, and right from the beginning it was a difficult birth. Remember, there were no effective pain relief options during the 16th century. But in the early hours of New Year's Day, 1511, the Queen gave birth to a baby boy, the future Prince of Wales. The king and his court rejoiced at the news, and a royal cannon salute rang out from the Tower Wharf. The Queen now moved to her presence chamber, where she would remain for another 30 to 45 days. This was, by the way, a absolutely common practice at the time. After giving birth, noble women went through churching to purify themselves. And Catherine would not breastfeed. There was a wet nurse for that. When he was 5 days old, the baby boy was christened Henry at Richmond. But 10 days after the christening, terrible news arrived. The boy had died. Catherine was distraught. The king, certainly concealing his own disappointment, comforted her as best he was able. Henry made no further showing of grief, continuing on with the affairs of state and his personal entertainments as normal. There is no cause of death for this young boy, by the way, nothing that I could at least find in the records. And of course, remember, infant mortality was horrifyingly high at the time. As disappointing as the death was, Henry and Catherine were still young, and as I mentioned, infant mortality was woefully high. There wasn't anything necessarily unexpected about this. That Easter, Pope Julius II bestowed on King Henry the Golden Rose, symbolizing the fruits of the Passion of Christ and papal favor. In 1515, Julius also would send to Henry a sword and cap of maintenance as part of Henry's initiation into the Holy League, an alliance of England, Spain, Venice, and the papacy against King Louis of France, though the Ottomans were probably the more obvious target. Henry was at Greenwich when, at the end of April 1512, the Palace of Westminster was destroyed by a fire that broke out in the kitchens. Westminster Hall itself, as well as 4 other large chambers, survived, but the balance was destroyed. The rooms that had been destroyed were not rebuilt, though Westminster Hall remained the official seat of government. The ruins themselves were not finally cleared away until 1532. The loss of his chief London residence forced Henry to look elsewhere in the capital for somewhere to lodge. Moving forward, Henry based himself primarily at Greenwich, but also made use of Richmond, Henry VII's favorite spot, and the London house of the Archbishop of Canterbury. In May 1512, William Blount, Lord Mountjoy, replaced the Earl of Ormond as Lord Chamberlain to the Queen. Mountjoy's promotion reflected the interest of the King and Queen in learning and humanism, as Mountjoy was a greatly respected humanist scholar. Henry VIII was keen to promote such men, especially early on in his reign, believing firmly that, as a Renaissance prince, it was his role to be surrounded by men of learning. In England, 5 men above all others were responsible for spreading this new humanist education: Desiderius Erasmus, John Colet, William Grocyn, Thomas Linacre, and most importantly for our purpose, Thomas More. Humanists drew their inspiration from Greek and Roman authors, principally Cicero. They wanted a more comprehensive, i.e., less scholastic, curriculum in the schools. They believed that every man had a duty to master his God-given talents, both intellectual and physical. They were fairly liberal in their approach to the world, calling for an end to all war and demanding that the wealthy help to support the poor. But above all else, what the humanists wanted was a broader approach to the universe. They wanted an end to the medieval pessimistic view of humanity and its inexorable focus on the life to come after death. Life was now, they wrote. It was time to live it, and to live it to the most of one's ability. These were the men who would shape the new English Commonwealth. And, sorry, by and large, women still need to wait about another 100 years before they could even begin to play some kind of a role. But I mean, hey, in terms of this podcast, we're closer to that date than ever before. So, there's that. Henry VIII absolutely wanted to be part of the humanist movement. He wanted to gain an international reputation as a patron of scholars, not merely for the prestige that brought him, but also because he genuinely enjoyed the stimulating atmosphere these men brought with them. According to Erasmus, Henry came to prefer the company of, quote, a galaxy of distinguished men, end quote, to that of, quote, young men lost in luxury or women or gold-chained nobles. The spread of humanism led to changes in attitude and the printing of more sophisticated works, some of which were controversial, some of which Henry would oppose as heresy. By and large, he was fine having the discussion. But if and once your ideas were deemed heretical, you had better drop them. The printed word was, of course, more influential in the early 16th century than it probably had ever been. Henry, like most monarchs, sought to control the printing presses with varying levels of success. Banned books could still be smuggled into England, though, of course, the smuggler did that at his peril. Likewise, Henry was one of the greatest English patrons of the arts of all time, especially painting. Elizabeth I, I think, tends to get all the glory in terms of patronizing the arts, but that's really just because of Shakespeare. Had Shakespeare lived a little earlier, then Henry VIII would be far and away the English monarch most associated with the arts in general. Henry spent vast sums supporting artists and purchasing their art. Now, that being said, there's no indication that Henry was up on the most avant-garde trends in painting and sculpture. Henry tended to copy the tastes of others, and especially, early on, Cardinal Wolsey. Most pictures in Tudor England that were painted at the time tended to be portraits, and portraiture evolved during Henry's reign and became extremely popular with the upper classes. But this is a podcast about history, not art. And Henry was more interested in making war on France than patronizing beautiful works of art as the calendar turned over to the year 1513. Henry proposed to the other members of the Holy League early that year that they should all go to war against France. Back in March 1512, Pope Julius had withdrawn Louis XII's title of Most Christian King and bestowed it on Henry. In addition, the Pope went out of his way to award all of the Kingdom of France to Henry, as though such were Julius's to give. Now all Henry had to do was go and win it. Henry sent a campaign that June under the Marquess of Dorset, but it ended in a complete failure. Now Henry was determined to lead an army himself. Of all the once vaunted Lancastrian lands in northern France, only Calais and its surrounding environs still remained in English hands. Henry hoped to change that. The young noblemen who made up Henry's entourage enthusiastically supported the idea. They were desperate for a grand adventure, for another Agincourt or Poitiers. Henry placed Thomas Wolsey in charge of raising the necessary funds for the invasion and for arranging all the logistics, something Henry did not have the patience for, but a task at which Wolsey excelled. Wolsey was absolutely determined to please Henry, as he would be his entire life. He knew early on that the way to success was to make himself indispensable to the young king. The two had a lot in common, by the way. Wolsey and Henry both loved opulence in all its form: art, music, revelry. He understood that Henry wanted to make England a power equal to France and Spain, and Wolsey was prepared to do everything in his power to bring that about. He perceived that the power of the law and the church could easily be twisted to serve Henry's purpose. Now, Henry loved Wolsey, but his growing power alarmed others in the Privy Council. Wolsey, more than anyone else, understood that Henry was bored by administration. He readily took it upon himself to, quote, disburden the king of so weighty and troublesome business. Ironically, Richard Fox had been the man to initially push Wolsey forward as a means of counterbalancing the Earl of Surrey's influence. But now, he found his own star being eclipsed by Wolsey. This did not overly concern Fox, however. He was elderly, and he had no interest in rising further. He also had no interest in a war with France. Fox was ready to retire to his diocese and spend his remaining years in quiet retirement. He didn't care how high Wolsey rose. In the end, the only people who actually opposed Henry's proposed war were his beloved humanists. They exhorted Henry to follow the example of the Prince of Peace, rather than Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar. Before leaving for France, Henry decided to put his house in order. There were rumors that Louis XII had determined to recognize Richard, the Earl of Suffolk, currently imprisoned in the Tower of London, as the rightful King of England. Henry had no tolerance for pretenders, so he promptly had Suffolk beheaded. He would have done the same to Suffolk's brother, but said brother was in France and out of Henry's reach. Henry wasn't on just some crazy, murderous rampage, though. He could be downright kind to his Yorkist relatives, and, provided they remained loyal, he was often generous to them. Even Margaret of Clarence, the widow to Suffolk's late father, was considered a woman of great importance and always welcome at Henry's court. Having dealt with Suffolk, Henry left Greenwich for Dover in early June 1513. He took a massive entourage, including the Duke of Buckingham, whom he preferred to keep close, given his tendency toward delusions of grandeur, i.e., Buckingham thought he might make a good king too. Then, on June 30th, he and his great army sailed for France. On July the 24th, Henry and his ally, the Holy Roman Emperor, laid siege to the town of Tournai. On August the 16th, imperial forces routed the French at the Battle of the Spurs, so named because of the haste with which the French retreated, and Tournai fell. After his victory, Henry spent 3 weeks with Margaret of Savoy, regent of the Netherlands, and daughter of the emperor. Things were going very well. But to the north of England, King James IV of Scotland decided this was the perfect time to invade. Technically, Scotland and France were allied, so James likely invaded after some prodding from King Louis. But James, too, was badly beaten and killed at the Battle of Flodden Moor on September the 9th, 1513, by the Earl of Surrey. Before the battle, Queen Catherine played her part, giving a rousing speech entreating the English to destroy the marauding Scots. She even suggested sending James' corpse over the channel so Henry could see it as a macabre trophy. She was told that was a bad idea, so she sent his blood-stained coat instead. Somewhat ironically, the Battle of Flodden Moor was a much more significant English victory than anything Henry would ever win in France. On September the 21st, he took the unimportant town of Tournai, but that would be the extent of his conquest. Queen Catherine, pregnant again, retired to the Tower as she came to term on October the 22nd, and Henry returned to England. He once more prayed for a son, and once more his prayers would go unanswered. The child was born premature and stillborn. In the end, Henry's little French adventure cost the treasury £1 million, nearly everything his father had left him, and gained only 2 insignificant towns. If he kept this up, then Louis would be the one with the last laugh. Nevertheless, always the optimist, Henry had his own agenda and hoped that, with the help of his allies in Spain and the Empire, next year he would conquer all of France. Spoiler alert, he doesn't. One thing that did come out of the French invasion was an influx of French culture. Henry and his friends got to see up close the Burgundian court and marveled at what they saw. Henry determined then and there that he would have a court equal to, if not greater than, what he had just witnessed. And at the end of that year, Henry celebrated a solemn Christmas. He had lost another child and a great deal of money. Worse still, around Christmas he was struck down with what was called a fever, but was probably smallpox, historians believe. By February he was out of bed again and, quote, fierce against France. He could not wait to return to the field. And the king had not forgotten the man who had made his invasion possible, appointing Wolsey as Bishop of Lincoln on March the 26th, 1514. But another invasion would have to wait. Behind his back, Spain and the Empire had signed a truce with France. Henry was livid and sought a scapegoat. He found one in the feckless daughter of the Ferdinand of Aragon, Queen Catherine. He refused to speak to his wife now and cut her out of his closest counsels. In Rome, there were even rumors that he planned to divorce her. Now, complicating this picture was Henry's sister, Mary. Mary had long been betrothed to Charles of Austria, Prince of Castile, heir to both Spain and, someday, the Holy Roman Empire. Henry VII had been the mastermind of her engagement, and now it was time for the marriage to go forward. Mary Tudor was, by all accounts, a very beautiful young lady, described as, quote, a nymph from heaven, a paradise. But now Henry was decidedly anti-empire, and Wolsey was quick to capitalize. Wolsey would remain pro-France and anti-empire throughout his career, believing that the Habsburgs were England's true enemies. It took a while to persuade the king to favor this new alliance with the hated French, but Henry had come to depend on Wolsey for advice. It was Wolsey he listened to now. So this whole marriage between Mary and Charles, well, it was off. This infuriated the older nobility, men like Buckingham, who considered war with France their birthright. Buckingham always hated Wolsey. He believed that only the nobility, not some arrogant yeoman church official, should rule England. Wolsey's admiration for France only made this hatred more acute. On May the 19th, 1514, the new Pope, Leo X, sent Henry a gift of a sword and a cap. The pontiff was also tired of Ferdinand's duplicity and was looking for a firm ally. He thought he had his man in Henry, and, initially at least, he was right. England might not be the land power that France or the Empire was, but he was growing into a formidable sea power, thanks in a large part to Henry. In fact, many historians still cite Henry as the father of the English Navy. By the end of his reign, he had built 46 warships, 13 smaller galleys, purchased 26 other ships, and captured 13 more. Henry had inherited only a few vessels from his father, so this was quite the improvement. What's more, Henry was interested in navigation, though he would, in the end, contribute very little to overseas exploration during his reign. Meanwhile, Wolsey's negotiations with France proceeded quickly. On July the 30th, 1514, Princess Mary formally renounced her betrothal to Charles. Instead, Wolsey had arranged a French match for the young, beautiful princess. She was to marry the 52-year-old Louis XII himself. Henry showed his gratitude to Wolsey by immediately nominating him as the new Archbishop of York, as the previous archbishop had just died in Rome. Mary expressed her immediate disgust at the match in a series of letters to Henry and Charles Brandon, with whom Mary was almost certainly in love. But her feelings mattered for very little amongst the concern for international relations. Wolsey, for his part, was duly consecrated Archbishop of York, though it would be several years before he actually visited his archbishopric. Wolsey was always much more interested in what wealth and power could do than the actual trappings of any office. On August the 13th, 1514, the whole court gathered at Greenwich for Mary's marriage, by proxy, to Louis XII. Mary was to leave for France at once. Evidently, the French king had heard tales of her beauty and was very keen to see her for himself. She took a large entourage with her to France, including 2 daughters of Thomas Boleyn we'll hear more about in the future, Mary and Anne. Princess Mary was formally married in person on October the 9th and then crowned the Queen of France on November the 9th. Louis was quite taken with her and boasted that on their wedding night he had, quote, performed marvels. Back in England, Henry had now begun a long-term affair with Elizabeth Blount. Blount bore Henry a son, which he decided to acknowledge. Perhaps he was truly taken with Elizabeth, or perhaps this was just an insurance policy if the Queen failed to bear any sons. The Queen, herself, distraught over the decision, gave birth to another son that February, who died almost immediately. But the big news continued to be in France. It turned out that Mary did not have to suffer through her marriage to Louis for very long. He died on New Year's Day, 1515. Mary got to be the Queen of France for about 2 months. Her reaction, though, was pure ecstasy over the death of her elderly husband, though initially everybody had to wait to see if she was pregnant. She would not be. And so Francis I would ascend the throne. And that's where I want to cut it this week, because next week we need to introduce Francis properly and bring another piece onto our board. If you're interested in additional content, supporting the show through Patreon, or signing up for Western Civ 2.0, our new subscription service, check out the links in the show notes.